You know, people always assume they know your story just by looking at you. They see an old woman in a faded cardigan, living in a modest apartment with creaky floors and second-hand furniture, and they think they've got it all figured out. That's exactly what happened to me this past Thanksgiving, and let me tell you, it was a lesson that changed everything for my family. My name is Eleanor, and I'm 73 years old. For the past 15 years, I've been living in a small one-bedroom apartment in Queens, New York. The walls are thin, the heating is temperamental, and my neighbors can be colorful, shall we say. But it's been my choice to live this way, and I had my reasons, good reasons. The apartment smells like the lavender sachets I keep in my dresser drawers, mixed with the faint aroma of the chamomile tea I drink every morning. My furniture's mostly from thrift stores and estate sales, a comfortable but worn green armchair where I do my reading, a small dining table that wobbles just slightly, and a bed that's seen better days but still gives me decent sleep. The refrigerator hums constantly, and sometimes I have to jiggle the handle on the bathroom door to get it to open properly. But here's what my family never knew. This simple life wasn't born out of necessity. It was born out of choice, out of wisdom, and out of a deep understanding of what really matters in this world. You see, I wasn't always living paycheck to paycheck. In fact, I was quite the opposite. My late husband, Robert, and we built something special together. He was a brilliant man, an engineer who invented several components that became standard in manufacturing equipment. Back in the 70s and 80s, those patents made us very comfortable indeed. We lived in a beautiful house in Westchester, had nice cars, took wonderful vacations. We could afford anything we wanted. But money, as I learned, has a way of changing people, not always for the better. When Robert passed away 8 years ago, I inherited everything. The house, the investments, the royalties from his patents that still bring in substantial income every month. I could have continued living in that big house, could have maintained the lifestyle we'd built together. Instead, I made a decision that shocked everyone who knew us. I sold the house and moved into this little apartment. I donated most of our expensive furniture to charity. I traded in my luxury car for a basic sedan that gets me where I need to go. To the outside world, it looked like I'd fallen on hard time, but that wasn't the truth at all. The truth was, I wanted to see who my children and grandchildren really were. I wanted to know if they would love me for me, not for what I could give them. I wanted to understand their character. When they thought there was nothing to gain from being kind to an old woman, it was a test, you could say. A test that would reveal everything. My daughter Sarah, bless her heart, she's always been wonderful to me. She visits regularly, brings me groceries, calls to check on me. She's never once asked about money or inheritance. She just loves her mother, and it shows in everything she does. When she looks at my small apartment, I can see concern in her eyes. Not for any inheritance, but genuine worry about whether I'm comfortable and happy. Sarah works as a nurse at the local hospital, and she's always been the type to take care of others. Even as a child, she'd bring home injured birds and stray cats, determined to nurse them back to health. That caring nature never left her. When she visits me, she brings homemade soup when I have a cold, helps me organize my medications, and always makes sure I have enough warm blankets for the winter. But my son Michael, well, Michael is a different story. He's successful in his own right, works in finance, lives in a gorgeous house in Connecticut with his wife Patricia. They have 2 children, my grandchildren, 16-year-old Jessica and 18-year-old Tyler. Michael visits occasionally, but there's always been this underlying tension when he sees how I live now. Michael inherited his father's analytical mind, but somewhere along the way, he became obsessed with status and appearances. During his visits, I'd catch him looking around my apartment with this expression, not quite pity, but something that made me uncomfortable. He'd make subtle comments about the neighborhood, about my situation, always offering to help in ways that suggested he thought I was failing to manage my life properly. "Mom, this area isn't safe for someone your age," he'd say, looking out my window at the diverse neighborhood where children played in the streets and families gathered on stoops. "Patricia and I have been talking, and we think you should consider moving somewhere more appropriate." I'd always politely declined, telling him I was perfectly fine where I am, which is true. I am fine, more than fine, actually. My neighbors are wonderful people. Mrs. Mrs. Chen from next door grows the most beautiful vegetables in her window boxes and always shares them with me. Mr. Rodriguez from downstairs helps me carry my grocery and never accepts anything in return except a smile and a thank you. The young mother in 3B, Maria, sometimes asks me to watch her toddler while she runs errands, and I treasure those moments. But Michael doesn't see any of that. He sees what he considers failure, decline, something to be fixed or hidden. Tyler, my grandson, he's about to graduate high school. He's a smart boy, got into a good college, but lately I've noticed something troubling in his attitude. He's become entitled, materialistic. He talks about brands and expensive things like they define a person's worth. When he visits, I can see him looking around my apartment with this expression, not pity, but something closer to embarrassment. The last time he visited, about 3 months before this Thanksgiving, he'd barely looked up from his phone during the entire visit. When I offered him homemade cookies, he said, "Thanks, Grandma, but I try to avoid processed sugar." They weren't processed. I'd made them from scratch, but he didn't seem to understand the difference. Jessica, on the other hand, has always been sweet. She's 2 years younger than Tyler, but she seems to have a better understanding of what matters. She asks about my neighbors, listens to my story, and always hugs me tight when she leaves. But I've noticed that even she's started to absorb some of her family's attitude about success and appearances. During one visit, she mentioned that her friends at school live in better neighborhoods, and I could see her starting to view my choices through the lens of social status rather than personal preference. Patricia, Michael's wife, has always been polite but distant. She comes from money, old money, the kind that comes with expectations and judgments. She's never been outright rude, but I can tell she doesn't understand why I choose to live the way I do. She speaks to me in the tone people use when they're being patient with someone they consider less fortunate, and that's what brought us to this particular Thanksgiving dinner, the one that would change everything. The invitation came from Michael, as it always does. "Mom, we're having Thanksgiving at our place, 2 o'clock sharp. Patricia's making her famous turkey." His voice on the phone was warm enough, but I could hear that familiar undertone, the one that suggested he was doing his duty as a son, checking the box of family obligation. I knew this dinner would be different somehow. There was something in the air, a tension that had been building for months. Tyler's attitude had been getting worse, more judgmental, more entitled. I'd heard from Sarah that he'd been making comments about me at family gatherings I hadn't attended, expressing embarrassment about having a grandmother who lived in the projects, which my neighborhood certainly wasn't, but that's how he saw it. I also knew that Patricia had been pressuring Michael to do something about my living situation. She'd made several comments about how it reflected on the family, how it was inappropriate for someone of my age to be living in such circumstances. As I prepared for this Thanksgiving dinner, I had a feeling that the test I'd been conducting for 8 years was about to reach its climax. The truth was, I'd been preparing for this moment. I'd been waiting to see just how far their judgment would go, how cruel they might become when they thought they were safe to express their real feelings. I spent the morning of Thanksgiving preparing myself emotionally and practically. I chose my outfit carefully, a simple navy blue dress that I'd bought at a discount store, comfortable shoes, and my mother's simple pearl earrings. I wanted to look presentable but not affluent, but I also made sure to bring something with me. In my purse, I carried a small leather portfolio that contained documents I'd been keeping ready for exactly this kind of moment. Documents that would change everything. The drive to Michael's house in Connecticut always reminds me of the life I used to live. These are the neighborhoods where Robert and I once belonged, where manicured lawns stretch like green carpets, and every house looks like it stepped out of a magazine. Michael's house is particularly impressive, a colonial with white columns and a circular driveway, surrounded by oak trees that must be 100 years old. When I knocked on the front door, I could hear the sounds of family gathering inside. Laughter, the clatter of dishes, the football game playing on the television. Patricia opened the door with a smile that seemed genuine enough, though I caught her eyes quickly scanning my outfit. "Eleanor, come in, come in. You look—" She paused, and I could see her searching for the right word. Nice. The house smelled incredible. Turkey and stuffing, cranberry sauce, and that particular aroma of a home filled with abundance. Their dining room table was set with fine china, crystal glasses, and cloth napkins. Everything was perfect, beautiful, expensive. expensive. Sarah was already there with her husband and 2 young children. She immediately came over and wrapped me in a warm hug. Mom, I'm so glad you're here. How are you feeling? Are you staying warm enough in that apartment? Before I could answer, Tyler appeared from the kitchen, tall and lanky in his designer jeans and brand-name sneakers that probably cost more than some people make in a week. He gave me a quick, perfunctory hug, the kind teenagers give when they're obligated to show affection but don't really want to. Hey, Grandma, he said, already pulling out his phone to check messages. Jessica was more genuinely warm, asking about my drive and helping me get settled. She's always been a sweet girl, though I've noticed she's starting to absorb some of her family's attitudes about material success. Dinner started pleasantly enough. Michael carved the turkey with ceremonial precision. Patricia served side dishes from expensive serving bowls, and everyone filled their plates with food that was, I have to admit, absolutely delicious. The conversation flowed around safe topics: school, work, the weather, holiday plans. I shared stories about my neighbors, including Mrs. Chen, who always saves me the best vegetables from her garden, and Mr. Rodriguez, who helps me carry my groceries up the stairs. These stories about my simple life in Queens seemed to make Michael and Patricia slightly uncomfortable, though they tried to hide it. That's nice, Mom, Michael said, his voice carrying that particular tone adult children use when they're trying to be supportive but are actually worried about their parents' choices. Tyler was barely participating in the conversation, mainly focused on his phone, until Patricia told him to put it away. That's when I noticed the shift in his demeanor. Without his phone to occupy him, he seemed restless, almost agitated. So, Tyler, I said, trying to engage my grandson, tell me about your college plans. Are you excited about starting next year? He looked up from his plate with a slightly annoyed expression. Yeah, I guess. I got into State University. Dad says it's a good school, even if it's not Ivy League. That's wonderful, I said sincerely. Education is such a gift. I'm sure you'll do great things. Tyler shrugged, but there was something in his expression that made me pause. I mean, I would have preferred somewhere more prestigious, but Dad says we need to be practical about costs. He glanced at his father, then back at me. Not everyone can afford the best, you know. The comment hung in the air for a moment. There was something pointed about it, something that felt deliberately aimed at me. Sarah, ever the peacemaker, jumped in. Tyler, State University is an excellent school. You should be proud. Oh, I am, Tyler said, but his voice carried a subtle edge. I just think it's interesting how different families have different opportunities. Patricia shot him a warning look, but Tyler either didn't notice or chose to ignore it. Instead, he seemed to be gaining confidence, as if he'd found an opening he'd been waiting for. I mean, some of my friends' families, they can afford to send their kids wherever they want. Private schools, expensive colleges, study abroad programs. It must be nice to have that kind of security. Michael cleared his throat uncomfortably. Tyler, we're very fortunate. You shouldn't complain about. I'm not complaining, Tyler interrupted, his voice taking on a tone I'd never heard from him before. I'm just making an observation about how different families handle money and planning for the future. He looked directly at me as he said this, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't idle conversation. This was deliberate. Some people, Tyler continued, cutting his turkey with unnecessary force, they plan ahead. They make sure they can take care of themselves when they're older. They don't become a burden on their family. The word burden hit me like a physical blow. I could feel Sarah stiffen beside me, and I saw Michael's jaw clench. Patricia looked like she wanted to disappear under the table. Tyler, Michael said in a warning tone. That's enough. But Tyler was 18 years old, full of himself, and apparently determined to make his point. What? I'm just saying it's important to think about these things. It's sad when people don't plan properly and end up, well, you know. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, the distant sound of the football game still playing in the living room, the slight whistle of wind through the window. Jessica looked mortified. Tyler, what's wrong with you? Nothing's wrong with me, Tyler said, his teenage defiance in full display. I'm just being realistic. It's hard to watch someone you love struggle because they didn't make good choices. And there it was, the moment I'd been waiting for and dreading for 8 years. Tyler's words hung in the air like poison gas. I could see the shock on everyone's faces. eyes, the way Sarah's hands had clenched into fists, the way Michael was staring at his son with a mixture of horror and recognition. "Tyler," Sarah said, her voice shaking with anger, "apologize to your grandmother right now." But Tyler was too deep into his righteousness to stop. For what? For being honest? Everyone's always tiptoeing around Grandma's situation, but nobody wants to say the obvious thing. He set down his fork and looked directly at me, his young face twisted with what looked like genuine disgust. "You used to live in a nice house, Grandma. You used to have nice things, and now you live in some run-down apartment in Queens, wearing clothes from thrift stores, barely getting by on whatever Social Security gives you." Each word was like a slap. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, not from shame, but from the sheer cruelty of it. "Tyler, stop," Jessica whispered, but her brother was on a roll. "It's embarrassing," he continued, his voice growing louder and more confident. "Do you know what it's like for me at school? When my friends ask about my family, and I have to explain that my grandmother lives in poverty, that she can't afford to help with college, can't even afford to buy decent clothes?" Patricia finally found her voice. "Tyler, you are being incredibly disrespectful." "Am I?" Tyler shot back. "Or am I just saying what everyone's thinking? That it's weird how Grandma went from being well off to whatever this is now?" He gestured at me as if my entire existence was evidence of some personal failure. "It's like a cautionary tale," he continued, warming to his theme. "Like, this is what happens when you don't plan properly for your future, when you don't make smart financial decisions, when you don't work hard enough to secure your old age." Michael stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "That's it. You're done. Go to your room." "I'm 18, Dad. I don't have to go to my room, and I'm not wrong." Tyler's voice was getting shrill now, defensive. "Everyone at school, when they find out my grandmother lives in some ghetto apartment, they feel sorry for me. They think our family is poor. It's humiliating." That's when something inside me snapped, not with anger exactly, but with a kind of crystal clear certainty. This test I'd been conducting for 8 years had just reached its conclusion, and the results were more devastating than I'd ever imagined. But I wasn't ready to reveal my hand just yet. I needed to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. "Tyler," I said, my voice calm despite the storm raging inside me, "you think I'm poor because I live simply?" "I think you're poor because you are poor," he said, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of someone who thought he was stating an obvious truth. "Look at your clothes. Look at where you live. Look at your life. And that embarrasses you?" "Of course it does." The words exploded out of him like he'd been holding them back for years. "My friends as grandparents live in nice retirement communities. They go on cruises. They help pay for college. They buy expensive Christmas presents. They don't show up to family dinners looking like they shop at Goodwill." Sarah slammed her hand on the table so hard the glasses jumped. "Tyler, that is enough." But Tyler was beyond stopping. "Why is it enough? Because it's true. Because nobody wants to admit that Grandma screwed up somewhere along the way, that she's become a burden on this family." "A burden?" I repeated, my voice still eerily calm. "Yes, a burden." Tyler was shouting now, his face red with emotion. "Dad feels obligated to check on you, to worry about you, to make sure you're not starving or freezing or whatever. Sarah brings you groceries because she feels sorry for you. We all have to pretend like everything's fine when it's obviously not." He stood up, pacing around the dining room like a caged animal. "And the worst part is, you seem happy about it. Like you're proud of living in poverty. Like there's something noble about being poor. Well, there isn't. It's just sad and pathetic." The silence that followed was absolute. Everyone was staring at Tyler with expressions of horror, shame, and disbelief. But Tyler wasn't done. "You know what really bothers me?" he continued, his voice dropping to a cruel whisper. "It's that you gave up. You had a chance to live with dignity, to age gracefully, to be the kind of grandmother I could be proud of. Instead, you chose this. You chose to be an embarrassment." That's when I stood up slowly, my hands steady despite the emotion coursing through me. The entire table fell silent, watching me with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Tyler," I said, my voice carrying a weight that made everyone lean forward slightly. "I need to tell you something. All of you, actually." I walked over to my purse, which I'd left on the side table near the entrance to the dining room. Inside, I always carry a small leather portfolio, something I'd brought today specifically because I'd had a feeling this conversation might happen eventually. I pulled out the portfolio and returned to the table, setting it down next to my plate. Tyler was looking at me with a mixture of confusion and condescension, like he was indulging a confused old woman who was about to make some pathetic excuse for her failures. "You think I'm poor," I said, looking directly at him. "You think I'm embarrassing. You think I'm a burden. You think I gave up, that I failed to plan properly for my future." Tyler's face was still flushed with righteous anger, but he didn't deny any of it. "You think I live in that apartment because I have no choice, because I'm a cautionary tale about what happens when you don't work hard or make smart choices." I opened the portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a bank statement, and I placed it on the table where everyone could see it. "This is my checking account balance as of last week," I said. The number on the paper was $847,392. Tyler's eyes widened as he read it, his mouth falling open slightly. The color drained from his face as if someone had pulled a plug. "That's my checking account," I continued, my voice still calm. "The account I use for daily expenses, for my groceries, my rent, my utilities. It's the account I consider my spending money." The silence in the room was so complete, I could hear my own heartbeat. Tyler's face had gone from red to pale, and he was staring at the bank statement like it might disappear if he looked away. But I wasn't finished. I reached into the portfolio again and pulled out another document. This one was more official looking, with the letterhead of a major investment firm. "This is my investment portfolio summary," I said, placing it next to the bank statement. "As of last month, it's worth approximately $14.3 million. Patricia gasped audibly. Michael's hands were shaking as he reached for the documents. Jessica's eyes were wide with shock and confusion. "And this," I said, pulling out a third document, "is the monthly royalty statement from your grandfather's patents. They still bring in about $180,000 per month, even 8 years after his death." Tyler had gone completely silent, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The arrogance, the cruel confidence, had evaporated completely. "Mom," Michael whispered, "I don't understand. If you have all this money, why are you living? Like I'm poor?" I finished for him. "Like I'm an embarrassment? Like I'm a burden?" I sat back down and looked around the table at my family. Sarah was staring at me with a mixture of shock and dawning understanding. Jessica looked confused but fascinated. Patricia appeared to be having trouble processing what she was seeing. And Tyler looked like his entire world had just been turned upside down. "I've been living modestly for 8 years, I said, "not because I had to, but because I wanted to, because I needed to know who you all really were when you thought there was nothing to gain from being kind to me." I pulled out one more document, a copy of my will, updated just last month. "You see, Tyler, I've been conducting a test of character, a test of love, a test of basic human decency, and you, my dear grandson, have failed that test in the most spectacular way possible." Tyler's voice was barely a whisper. "Grandma, I didn't know. I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did," I said firmly. "You meant every word. You were cruel, judgmental, and heartless. You treated me like garbage because you thought I was poor. You were embarrassed by me, ashamed of me, disgusted by me." I looked at each family member in turn. "Sarah, you passed this test with flying colors. You visited me regularly, brought me groceries, worried about my comfort and happiness. You never once asked about money or inheritance. You just loved your mother. That's worth more than all the money in the world." Sarah was crying now, tears streaming down her face. "Mom, you shouldn't have had to test us. We should have just what?" I asked. "Should have just been good people?" "You're right, but this test showed me who you really are, and I'm proud of the woman you've become." I turned to Michael, who was still staring at the documents with a stunned expression. "Michael, you've been a decent son in your own way. You've worried about me, offered to help, suggested I move somewhere better. Your heart was in the right place, even if you didn't understand my choices. But you also allowed your wife and your son to develop attitudes that should have troubled you." Michael looked up at me, his eyes filled with confusion and regret. "Mom, I had no idea. I thought you were struggling. I thought maybe Dad hadn't left you as well off as I'd assumed." "I know what you thought," I said. "And while your concern came from love, you also made assumptions about my choices without ever asking me directly what was going on." I turned to Patricia, who was sitting very still, her face pale. "Patricia, you've always seen me as beneath you. You've made comments about my neighborhood, my clothes, my lifestyle. You've pressured Michael to do something about me because you thought I was an embarrassment to the family image." Patricia opened her mouth to protest, but I held up my hand. "And you, Tyler," I turned to look at my grandson, who was now openly crying. "You failed this test in the most spectacular way possible. You didn't just assume I was poor. You were cruel about it. it. You were embarrassed by me. You talked about me like I was some kind of failure, some cautionary tale to be avoided. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the perfectly manicured lawn. You made it clear that in your mind, a person's worth is determined by their bank account and their possession. You called me pathetic. You called me an embarrassment, called me a burden. When I turned back to face the table, Tyler was sobbing, his shoulders shaking. Grandma, please. I'm sorry. I didn't know. You were just showing me who you really are, I said. And Tyler, I don't like the person you've become. I walked back to the table and gathered the document. I've lived in my little apartment for 8 years, and I've been happier there than I ever was in that big house in Westchester. Do you know why? Because I learned who my real friends were. I looked directly at Tyler, Mrs. Chen, who saves me vegetables from her garden. She doesn't care about my bank account. Mr. Rodriguez, who helps me with groceries. He doesn't judge me by my clothes. Maria, who trusts me with her children. She sees my character, not my possessions. I pulled out the copy of my will and placed it on the table. This document reflects how I've chosen to distribute my estate based on the character each of you has shown me during these 8 years. Tyler's face went even paler. What? What does that mean? It means that Sarah, who loved me unconditionally, who never judged me, who treated me with respect and kindness, regardless of my circumstances, will inherit the majority of my estate. About $12 million, plus the royalties from your grandfather's patents. Sarah gasped, but I continued. Jessica, who has been generally sweet and kind, though sometimes influenced by her family's attitudes, will receive $1 million for her education and future. I looked at Michael. Michael, who was well-meaning but allowed harmful attitudes to flourish in his household, will receive $1 million, enough to be comfortable, but not enough to maintain the lifestyle of judgment and materialism that seems to define this family. Patricia's face was white as paper. And me? You, Patricia, will receive nothing. You've made it clear that you find me and my choices distasteful. You won't have to worry about being associated with my money. Finally, I turned to Tyler. And you, Tyler, you who called me pathetic and embarrassing, you who said I was a burden, you who treated me with such cruelty and disrespect. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. You will receive exactly what you think I'm worth. Nothing. Tyler's sob was like a physical blow. Grandma, no, please, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. I was just trying to sound grown up or something. I don't really think you're embarrassing. I love you. Love isn't enough, Tyler, I said sadly. Love without respect, without kindness, without basic human decency is meaningless. You showed me exactly how you feel about people you perceive as less fortunate than yourself. I gathered my purse and the documents. I'm going to go home now, to my little apartment in Queens, where I'm surrounded by people who treat each other with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. As I walked toward the door, Tyler jumped up from his chair. Grandma, wait, please, I can change. I can be better. I was just being stupid. Please don't do this. I turned back to look at him. Tyler, you're 18 years old. You're about to go to college, about to become an adult. Today, you had a choice to make about who you want to be. You chose to be cruel. You chose to be judgmental. You chose to value money over character. I paused at the door. Actions have consequences, Tyler. The way you treat people matters. Character matters. And today, you showed me exactly what your character is worth. I walked out into the crisp November air, leaving behind a family that would never be quite the same. As I drove home to my little apartment in Queens, I felt a strange sense of peace mixed with profound sadness. The test was over. The results were clear. And sometimes the most important lessons are the ones that cost us the most to teach. 3 months later, Tyler showed up at my door. He'd been thinking, he said. He'd been volunteering at a homeless shelter, trying to understand what it really meant to struggle. He wanted to apologize, not for the inheritance, but for the person he'd been. I don't want your money, Grandma, he said, tears in his eyes. I want your forgiveness. I want to be the kind of person you could be proud of. That's when I knew that sometimes the most expensive gift you can give someone is the truth about themselves. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that truth can transform them into someone worth loving again. But that, as they say, is another story entirely.